Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. But what I find strange personally, Catherine, is when people talk about their lives. And I know that it's a normal thing that makes me strange. But I'm curious to talk to you. This is Catherine Hunter we're talking to, who is a poet, professor, novelist, and all around great person. And Catherine, in particular, I wanted to talk to you as somebody who's done a lot of writing in a lot of different ways. But I know specifically the thing that kind of comes to my mind of your more recent work is this book you wrote called After Light, which concerns, I think is a novel, but also concerns some actual events that kind of connect to your family's history. And so I was wondering if you could just sort of talk a bit about what that book is and kind of maybe a bit about your process of writing it. And in the course of that, I think we can maybe open the discussion up to just sort of broader concerns around, writing fiction or nonfiction or poetry and so on. But could you maybe just start with about that particular book?
Yeah, sure. It's a great topic, and and I'll talk first about Afterlight, and then we can go on. And I would also like to talk a little bit, so I hope I don't forget, to talk a little bit about teaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talking to students about writing your family history or whatever it is. So, so in my family, there were some, one thing I was mainly, I guess my father was a kind of, he passed away in like 1999, so it's a long time ago, but growing up with him was really quite an experience, and he had a very dramatic life that had in it a narrative arc, like kind of like very heavy drama. And he did want to write about his own life, but it was very difficult for him to do that. He was a pretty good teller of stories, and he could give things a bit of a dramatic twist. And also his sister, my aunt, who lived in New York. So I didn't talk to her a lot, but sometimes we'd visit her in New York, or she would phone. She used to always phone on American Thanksgiving, for example. And she told me some kind of amazing stories from the family history on my dad's side. But anyway, so my father grew up in Brooklyn, New York, at a time when, in a very poverty-stricken time of, I guess, the 20s and 30s, the 30s. And the family had, they had many, many children. His dad was unemployed a lot. And so I heard a lot of these stories. It was like a ghetto where he grew up. When he was in about grade 5, he dropped out of school. So he had a grade 5 education. And then he started learning how to do bricklaying and carpentry and those kind of jobs. So he was really quite successful. He's a hardworking kind of guy. And then the war broke out, and Canada, like Britain, declared war on Germany, blah, blah. You don't need a history lesson from me. But in I think it was in 1940, my dad was, learning about what the Nazis were doing in Germany and all of this, and he decided he wanted to go over there and fight in the war. But because the United States was not in the war yet, he went up to Montreal from New York, which is not far, and joined the Black Watch and went to fight for the Canadian Army, and that's why we're Canadian now. So what happened to my dad during the war, though, was that he's about 25, 26 years old, and he had a big explosion and severe damage to his face, and he lost both of his eyes. So there's a phrase, among blinded people, which is totally blind. And that's what he was. He could not see at all, no light, no nothing. So then he had to go through this rehabilitation, emotionally, physically, mentally. And then the Canadian government offered him that he could go to university. So he had to work very hard to upgrade from grade 5 to handle the University of Toronto. And then he ended up getting a master's in social work. And while he was there, a very lovely young woman who had volunteered to read to the blind ended up being my mother. Anyway, so that's where they met. And so over the years, he would tell these stories to us, like little vignettes kind of from his life. And he actually got me to write them down sometimes. But as he was talking, like writing is just really, really hard. And he had no experience in doing it. He definitely had this flair for drama and for the shape of a story. And for some of the moments that he would put into these stories, you'd be like, oh, wow, right? Like that should be really a book, or a story. So anyway, after he passed away, I felt like I really wanted to kind of write the story of my dad. And that I ran into, the problem I ran into was lack of evidence of what really exactly happened. And I ended up doing a lot of research. But at one point I decided, no, you know what? I have to fictionalize this. It's the only way I can tell this story is to turn it into fiction. And then interestingly enough, after I just made that decision, and then I did all this research work in some National Archives of Canada and everything, I actually did find out a lot of those blanks, what had happened where, but it was impossible to really figure out for sure, which boat he was on, say at Dieppe, like he was part of the Dieppe raid. And you could see that on his record, but anyway, I learned a lot about military history while I was doing this. So it's kind of interesting. And it's, the military history is all about the generals and the politicians and these big campaigns. And, like you see on TV, there's a map and they're sticking pins in the map. But what I wanted to tell was the story of the soldiers on the ground, and what happened to them. So I was nervous about this book. Oh, and then I decided I had to write about the generation before him.
Sure.
And so my aunt had told me about our grandmother, but it was really our grandmother's sister. But I turn her, by the magic of fiction, I turn her into my blinded character, whose name was Frank. I turn her into his mother, because her story was just more interesting than the story of my actual grandmother. So this would have been my great aunt, I guess. And because she had been in Ireland, forced as a teenager, forced to marry this widower who would have been in his 40s, or at least 40, and who already had children. And this was very common. I didn't realize it, but when I started doing research, I saw many allusions to, especially at, help me out here, Jonathan. When immigrants come into New York, they go to an island called Ellis Island.
Ellis Island, yes.
Yes, Ellis Island. And when I was there reading, our history about immigrants, many European women were in that situation, and certainly in Ireland, right? You're living in poverty, there's not enough, and that's a whole other historical lesson, which I won't go into, but so I thought that was really interesting. And what my aunt had told me when I was quite young, so say I would be maybe 12 and I'm hearing this story about this woman who was 15 or 16 and was forced into marriage to this guy. And I remember my aunt saying in her Brooklyn accent, which I can no longer imitate, she's been gone too long, but she was saying, and they told her, you got to marry him because, he's rich. He's got a bicycle. He had a bicycle. And
Relatively speaking.
I think he maybe had a donkey as well. So, this was considered wealth. And I can remember that very distinctly, listening to this and going, oh my goodness, right? This is a story. I want to know more. And so I end up sort of making up this whole family. So sometimes, people ask me, well, what parts of that were like so-called real? And interesting, because do you know whether, the stories that your aunts and grandparents and even your own parents told you when you were growing up about other people in the family? Because they're inevitably going to leave something out, either by accident or on purpose, or there's going to be things that they didn't know.
Well, one of the things that I find really interesting in that wider arena of like, well, what actually happened, because as you say, there's like, a level at which you can maybe find documents or records, but even those will be incomplete or just potentially wrong, right? Something, as you know from working in the university, if there's one form that says it, another form will say it, and it doesn't necessarily. And there's this level at which, at a certain point in history, now we're just relating to the previous form and not necessarily to reality anymore. And may or may not accord to reality, but there's a wonkiness there often. But the thing I find really interesting in terms of people's memories in particular, and different people remembering the same things, is that of course you can't trust that. Like in fact, I remember reading somewhere that when they do investigations, one of the tip-offs, you might know more about this as somebody who's researched, to write mystery novels. But one of the tip-offs I understand in an investigation is everybody has the same story, they're probably lying. And like if they're not inconsistencies, then likely it's a fabricated story.
Yes, in a criminal investigation, yeah, it's like, because they're like talking to each other, we got to get our story straight, right?
Yeah, by accident or design, they've just repeated a story rather than maybe what the facts were.
Yeah, interesting. And your sibling, this is a common among siblings, right? You grow up together, and then you're older and you're all sitting around, and somebody will say, "Oh, remember that time that
remember that green bike?" It's like, well, that bike was blue.
That's right, exactly.
And then it turns out it was actually purple when you find a photograph, right?
Yeah. Or it was a tricycle or something like.
Yeah.
And a lot of arguments occur among siblings about stuff like that. And in my family, we've just learned to go, oh well, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Something like that happened along the way somewhere. And I've also experienced moments of awareness, which are kind of rare, in myself, where I suddenly realized, oh no, that's a crossover.
Yeah.
Element from a different time. And I can remember once this happening actually within the space of about an hour, when I had seen somebody somewhere, and then I was asked to report like what I had seen, and I told them what he was wearing. And then I actually realized after, no, that wasn't him wearing that. That was the guy that was just walking down the hall, like a different guy. Because you're not.
They've done brain studies into this thing too. Like when you actually remember something, you don't remember something, like you don't recall it from, it's being saved on your brain computer, right? You're actually fabricating the memory in the telling of it. Like in remembering it, you create the memory. And so sure, there's something it's based upon, but it very quickly these things change and grow, and you start remembering the memory that you had last time instead of the original thing. But what I think is interesting in all this, there's a couple of things that are really interesting in there, but where I kind of wonder, and maybe this kind of bleeds into another topic, which is teaching writing, which is like when you kind of are moving past, say, telling family stories or this communal activity and trying to move towards like something you might publish and share with the wider world, or you might just want to craft into an artistic form. Like, what are some of the things that you think kind of need to be considered when we're not just creating, say, a fiction, but something that is containing these elements of actual life or actual people? Like for the, even though you wrote a novel, for example, it is family history that you're getting in there. And and it's not just, of course, you that has an opinion on the family history, right?
Yeah.
So how do you kind of contend with that, or think about that, or negotiate that, or what do you advise people who want to write about their experiences? But of course, keep in mind, their experiences aren't just theirs, right?
That's right. So I have, it's very common for students, of all ages and at all levels, to ask me to say something to me like this. Well, my aunt, was this very cruel person, right? And she did these terrible things to us. I'm making this up right now, but and I really want to write about that because it affected me, right? So deeply. And but I'm afraid, because my mom will be really angry, right? If I write this stuff about her sister or whoever. Or it might be their own parents, right? Or their grandparents or their brother or sister or something like that. And they really want to tell these stories. So it depends. My advice always depends on how far along this person is in the project and how far along this person is in their experience as a writer, right? So if it's somebody who's just starting to write stuff, and I teach, people in poetry as well as prose. So, and I actually would like to talk about that a little bit, but in a second. But I often will say, I have been known to say to somebody, well, you know what? How people feel when a book comes out, worrying about that's step number 6,492, and you're at step number 26. So, don't worry about it right now. And if it is, but if it's really developing and coming along, I think that sometimes, and this is a weird psychological thing that I don't even know if it's real or if it's just me, but I think that characters' names are really important. And there's been times when I've been struggling to write a story, totally fiction, right? And I can't think of the right name for that person. And it really bugs me. And so I'll be putting in like an X or Bob or something, you know what I mean? And I know I haven't found the real name yet. And then when I find the real name, suddenly, things start to happen, to shape. So if you were writing about, you're at Griselda, maybe you start off using her real name, just for yourself, for your own memories and things. And then I always tell people, like, you have to have a private place, like where you can lock up a notebook or keep it somewhere where nobody can get it, or it's on your computer, you have to have a password, because you have to feel secure as you begin to write it, that nobody's, if you're worried about what your family's going to think, you have to know that they're not going to see it. And then you keep going. And then there's a shift at one point where you have to decide, say it's prose, you really have to decide whether it's going to be memoir, in which case there's an expectation that you will use, that you will tell like the truth as far as we know it. And even in memoir, sometimes people, I'm just listening actually to an audiobook about a terrible series of marriages that this woman had, and she has changed people's names. But at the beginning of the book, she says, this is all true, right? I've just changed their names because some of these really super abusive guys, I'm sure they would, I don't know what they would do to her. But so you can alter names in a memoir. But we all know, like, say you live in Winnipeg, everybody knows you, everybody knows who your brother is and all of those things. So it becomes difficult. So you can but you can tell the emotional truth as fiction, right? You can disguise, when we were talking earlier, Jonathan, you used the word coded, right? So you can code things or disguise them in some way. And you know what's a really good trick when writing a fictional story that's based on something real? Is just to change the gender, because people never seem to suspect that. So maybe I shouldn't have said that. But, sure. To change the gender, change the name, change the relationship. If in real life you're writing about your brother, totally change it. Put him in a different city, give him a different occupation. Don't have the narrator related to him at all, or do a third person narration. There's all these ways that you can get at emotional truth, right?
I've always felt like Werner Herzog has this idea of the ecstatic truth, this notion that somehow it doesn't attend to the facts of the case so much as it attends to the emotional quality of the case, but also could include certain facts that help to anchor it
Yeah.
in, like there's a level of selection involved, but he's and Herzog, of course, in his films will do like weird combinations of fiction and nonfiction. Like he'll make a fictional film where he does about a guy who's hauling a boat over a mountain, and then he does haul a boat over a mountain in the course of making that film, right? Like he'll do these weird hybrids. But so to me, like there's it's hard for me to kind of counsel people around it, because what I tend to sort of avoid it in certain ways, in part because I'm kind of a private person, but more I think because I don't think it's super interesting. Like I have this idea that like even though I've had interesting experiences and have had like you know drama in my life, like I feel like my joke about it is, as a straight white male age 25 to 65, like my opinions and feelings are represented in the culture already. And like me writing my story, it does have a value, but it doesn't have, say, the value that somebody with a more unique experience might have, like uh so that's just more a joke than anything. But like there is, I think, a level at which I try to keep in mind when I'm writing that, like, even though something may have felt very unique and specific to me, it doesn't mean that it is. Probably 10 million people had that thing happen to them in some different form. And so unless I can go the extra step of trying to find something particular in it, that's so I usually just will cut to that. I'll just cut to like, well, what's interesting about me going through it from a more of a third party objective point of view is actually this feeling. And so it doesn't have to attach. So if I just get at that feeling, maybe I'll just make the whole thing surrealist and not connect it to reality anymore, as long as I get that feeling out. But other people might be finding it more necessary. I recognize, though, that other people might find it more necessary to work through those things that have happened to them in writing in a different or more direct way. And there's a value in that, like I say, especially if somebody has had a like a more kind of unique experience in such as, or one that could help others and isn't so overrepresented in the culture as, say, what some of the things that happened to me. So it's hard, though, because it's hard to know how to advise somebody about it without, I think you're getting some really interesting practical things. So one, just the idea that you would worry about it later, what people are going to think, because you may find by the time you get to that point, you don't even care anymore. Like after you write it, you may not even care about sharing it anymore for
Yes.
some people, right? In which case it never becomes an issue what somebody's going to think about it, if it's just for you. Ultimately, whether you realize that at the start or after you've written a draft or two of it, I think you're right to point out that, like, probably a lot of people are torturing themselves over things they don't need to, if only for that reason.
And a lot of them are just learning to write.
Yeah.
So, writing about your childhood is what Rilke says, that's your jewel, right? That you have.
Yeah.
And then I always like to add to students, even if your childhood was really rotten and a lot of suffering, that's still material, right?
Yeah.
So, so they're just learning to write. And if this is a story that they really want to get out, I think they should write it, but don't worry yet. Like later, and a lot of writers return again and again and again to the hard knot, that's at the center of some of the things that occurred to them when they, happened to them, or that they did when they were young.
Sure.
I think especially in the case of people who have survived horrific experiences, or violence or terrible accidents or acts of terror that other people have perpetrated upon them, they kind of need to go through that material. And if they're writers, they'll do it through writing. and then you really do have to learn how to write, right? So you
Hmm.
may write that story 7 times in your life, and I'm not counting all the drafts, right?
It's funny that you
And
say that. It makes me think of this when you mentioned the Rilke childhood, is your jewel. It actually made me think of in the National Gallery. I have this long sequence about Rilke, like
right,
rewriting Rilke's elegies, Duino elegies. But what's interesting, but in that book, and also in my short story book, Lighting Impossible Storms, I took the same childhood experience, which is this moment I found this bird, this dead bird, and it looked like it was alive, and I turned it over. I picked it up to maybe help it, but it was just maggots inside the bird making it move, seeming like it was alive, and it just fell apart in my hands. Like that was really, I mean, it's a moment that was just a really powerful childhood moment for me, and I actually literally put it into 2 books in different ways, but it's the same story, and it's like I had to approach it differently in both cases so that would fit, and like there's all these artistic considerations that come into it, but part of it's just like that weird, for whatever reason, that was a thing for me, that moment, right? And you never know until you really start writing even what in those moments in your life actually affected you. Like I don't know if I've had that experience where I've actually have written about my life, like the thing I thought actually was the big deal to me wasn't. It was some other thing inside of it, and until I really had um put it down on paper, I couldn't see it. Like you can't really even see inside your own head until you start to externalize it in a sense.
yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I think there's been so many, unfortunately, kind of phony or flaky, people saying, teaching writing as therapy, that it has become really something I absolutely abhor to say, and I avoid saying. Sometimes it's not healing right away. Sometimes it's
Sure.
very difficult. And you're like, why did I do this? And it's painful. And then there's a couple of things I want to say about genre too, with writing about
Hmm.
family. Um, you're So when you start off writing a memoir, or about your own life, or maybe your dad's life, for example, um, you and then you start thinking about getting it published. Unless you're famous, right?
Yeah.
There's no market for it, and I think that there might have been in the past a market for my father's story, true story, right, of a blinded vet who, because everybody who heard about him, back in the 60s and 70s, was like, oh, what? Really amazed, And like I remember one time we had what was it, something in our house that required the police to be there. It might have been that time we had a fire, maybe, or maybe something had been stolen. I don't know. But my mother was showing the police or the fire guys around. And then later they said, well, Mrs. Hunter, there's something about your story that just, doesn't ring true, because you told us that your husband was totally blind, and you got all these power tools down there in the basement. And my mom's like, oh yeah, those are his, he uses them. They're like, what? And so all the things that he did, everyone, I can remember people all the time saying, oh, your dad's so amazing. But what made that so amazing were all these myths about disability, right? And people
Sure.
never wanting to get close to anybody that was, as that severely disabled, and so not getting to know them, and all these sort of things. So nowadays, I don't think, it had to be a really, really well-written book to sell at all, but there'd be no way to market it.
Sure.
So there's that, and then there's the genre of memoir, right? I don't think you can just write your life story unless you've done something fantastic or you're already famous for some other reason. So then there's lyric poetry, which is also very tricky in
Hmm.
terms of, is it true or not? Because and I think especially as teachers of English, as academics, as well as being poets, both of us, you try to teach the poem, you try to separate that I, right, from the actual poet, in a way that is, I think I'm better at explaining it now than I was when I first started teaching, because now I've learned to say, well, you know, that's just the way Sylvia Plath was feeling maybe that day that she started writing the poem, you know. And then after that, she took a step back and she started, you know, and I showed them her drafts, you know, like she started crafting it and shaping it, you know, into a work of art. And that we have many selves, different selves inside of, you know, of us, right? And we might feel one way one day and another. That doesn't mean that that person walked around feeling that way all the time. I say Dylan Thomas was not drunk every day, please. Certainly not when he was writing. And so
there's also there's also an interesting craft problem, I think, with that eye when you're trying to teach it, because I don't know how you found it, but what I found is that people don't want to separate the eye, right? And the reason they don't want to often is because they feel like it's somehow inauthentic, but also won't be impactful. So they feel like, but I'll often try to convince people of is that what you have to think through is, you know, how is a reader going to receive it? Yeah, and your task, like if you want to write a poem about how you love your dog, I think the problem is that you can't just say that how much you love your dog, because that's not interesting to anyone else. What you need is them to love the dog. You know, so you need to show them how that dog is lovable and why you have to kind of make them fall in love with the dog the way that you fell in love with it, and by replicating that moment maybe, or whatever. Like you have to kind of put them in your shoes rather than focusing on your eye so much, or you just can't have the intended effect. It's, you know, otherwise it's like so it's like when you know, your friend walks up to you, starts telling you all about their day, and you're like, well, what do I care about any of this stuff? But it matters to them, right? Yes. But if they if you'd gone through their day, it would maybe matter to you too. But you need to have those moments first.
Well, and if it's my friend telling me that, I care because that's my friend.
Sure, you already care about them.
Yeah, but when you're writing a poem, you're writing to complete strangers. I think that's one of the hardest things to teach, is that I hate to tell you this, but the person reading your poem, I mean, what we are aiming for in terms of craft is for that piece we just wrote to interest a complete stranger.
I like to suggest a hostile stranger. Like imagine somebody doesn't want to read it. Christian Book told me that once. You know, the people don't want to read poems. You know, they'd rather have a blank piece of paper is worth more than one with a poem written on it. And you know, you could at least, you know, put something. You know, you'd have to throw it away. You can't even put it back in the printer. And I think this, you know, it's kind of an overstatement, but I think there's something in that in terms of like how hostile a reader can be, potentially, you know, to like your point of view. Now, obviously, if they went and bought the new Catherine Hunter book, they care about what Catherine Hunter has to say, but that's not really where a lot of people are coming into the book from, you know? Yeah.
And I was, when you said somebody who really doesn't want to read a poem, I was picturing, you know, an overworked editor who was just 16 hours going through the slush pile. So it has to somehow stand out. But this idea that like, even if we fully understand about separating the eye, you know, out, and a lot of very sophisticated poets still don't understand that. They're saying, I don't like these lyric poems. It's all I. It's all about me. And I'm like, no, that's a trope.
Yeah.
You know, of lyric poetry. Like it's not, I don't know where they're coming from, but
I made a joke about that in the National Gallery, you know, where I think I've got a line where like poets offer to speak truth, but then only speak of themselves. But it's a bit of a, you know, that's like the cliche of it, right? You know, that people have this idea that it's somehow self-absorbed, when of course a good poem is not doing that. It's maybe seeming to do that, but it's doing this other thing. But it's doing this more tricky movement.
Yeah. So, but people do expect, like one example I've used in teaching is now my mother has passed away long ago, but if my mother were, I'm trying to think of somebody who in my life who is still alive, but and it's also tricky because I don't want to curse anybody with bad luck. But say my mother was alive, and I wrote a poem about the death of my mother and how sad I was over it, and going to her funeral, and what flowers I'd put on her grave and all of this. And then I sent that to a magazine and it got published. Well, my other poets who knew me, I tell my students, they would be writing to me from all across the country saying, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that your mom died. And then if I said to them, oh, you guys, that wasn't real, it's just a poem, my mom's fine, they would like dislike me a lot, right? They would think I was, what is wrong with you, right? So it's a convention that we very much live with on a very basic practical level. And I think people do understand that, you do change some details in a poem, right? You put in dandelions instead of pansies because it has the right number of syllables, or it fits in with the color pattern that you're working with, or something like that. So you change small details, but you don't write a story about, like, I would never, or a lyric poem. I would never write a lyric poem about like growing up in Texas, because I didn't. So it's interesting to think about what's real, and talking about your family, any family things you say in a lyric poem, people are going to take them as being true. So it's something to think about.
I think something also that is a hard thing for students to think about, well, anyone, not just students, but a hard thing for writers to think about, I think, is if you're writing about something that has some basis in life, there's the perspective fact, the fact that you have your perspective on it, but another person involved doesn't have that same perspective. And you have to contend with that potentially in a very real way, maybe, like, it's not likely that they would sue you, but in some, right, theoretically, if you're writing about, Comrade Black and what he's done to you, he might sue you, right? But like on the less extreme example, people remember things differently, and they have different points of view on them, and they have their reasons for X. You may just, so there's a level of research, even weirdly, you kind of, just to go back to the research thing for a second, I'm curious to know like what kind of research you did or might suggest people do if they are kind of at that later stage where they're really thinking about publishing something that does involve other people in their life and so on. Like, because what do you suggest people even just think about in terms of like, whether you ask somebody and get their permission, or do you get like their point of view at least, even if you don't agree with it? Like, do you try to represent them, or do you not do that? Like, what are some of the things you kind of, in terms of contending with other people's points of view or their feelings about, these events, what do you sort of suggest or think about when that stuff comes into play?
I think try to avoid it, actually.
That's what I usually do, but I don't know if it's
if you're writing, if you want to write a story that's set in a certain time period, and you're lucky enough that your grandparents are still around and you have a good relationship with them, then I think it's great to say, hey, can we talk about, I want to set this story back in Portage la Prairie in the 1950s or whenever you were living there. Could you just talk about that? And it's going to depend what kind of person your grandmother or whoever it is, right? Some people love to tell stories. My dad liked to tell these stories, right? And so I was all the time, I don't think he realized, oh, she's going to grow up to be a writer. Or maybe he did, sometimes I was worried about that book because even though it's fiction, it has this severely traumatized, blinded veteran who's very violent, it's obviously my dad. So I was afraid certain things about what my brothers would think, about him. And so I remember saying to my one older brother, after it came out, I said, I feel kind of bad in some ways about the way I portrayed this character, and I don't know what Dad would have thought. And my brother said to me, "Are you kidding? Dad would have loved it." So, because I think my brother is saying to me, Dad wanted people to see how he was suffering, you know,
Sure.
because all of that was kept secret in the family, right? In those days, everybody thought he was this amazing, wonderful person, right? And he was an amazing, wonderful person, but he also had this, severe problems, and that we all kept quiet about, crazy culture we live in. Just
Yeah, but it is a cultural thing, right? That I think it still hasn't fully gone away, although it's
no,
lessened in many ways. There's that idea, and in some ways you can see like, you know, different people have their points of view, and it's hard to kind of sort everything, to sift away the points of view and just look at like the objective data of it, and it's not even interesting. Like why was the great failure of the I forget the names all of a sudden, but the novelist, the new novel, where
Jonathan Franzen.
no, it's literally the nouveau roman nouveau.
Oh, right, yes.
Yeah, where they're just here's how many bananas were on the tree. It's like, well, okay, but it's interesting in a certain experimental way, but there's a limit to its interest, unless you start to, and even and they also just found it's impossible to not bring the perspective in, because the recording selection of the facts you pay attention to starts to become a perspective. I remember once having an argument with a newspaper journalist. They were saying, people have this idea that you can't write by unbiased articles, but I do all the time. And I said, well, but when you write about a war, I go, do you report on what the ants think?
Yeah.
Or how many ants got squashed? I go, of course not. So even if you're being balanced, you have a human perspective, and it's not right or wrong, but it's something to consider. And there's other human perspectives, and it gets very messy very quick, right? And so I feel like in some ways, like my answers often like try to avoid it or disguise it, so that you can at least serve your own purposes, but hide what you're doing from people who might hate you for it.
You have to protect yourself, I feel.
At the same time, I don't know if that's the best advice, in the sense of like, it then kind of protects the situation it protects people from, and kind of allows for things to occur. So it's a tough bind, though, I feel.
Well, it's personal in many ways. The writer Carol Shields has, made a point of saying in a couple of essays that, or in conversation, that she doesn't want to hurt anybody in her life. She just doesn't want to. Her art is not that important to her, that she feels that she has to, put these terrible truths out there. And so it is kind of up to the personality of the person. And anybody who's met Carol knows that she's very nice. And I also feel in a way that as a human being, I have some kind of responsibility to other people, that it's wrong for me just to say, well, it's my art, I'm an artist, I have to do this, because a lot of the things that I also have experienced, or that people very close to me have experienced, are horrific, traumatic things. There's a lot of times when, you've witnessed something that's really horrible, and you decide you're not going to tell, somebody in your family or your friends about it, because you don't want to pass that on to them. And then they're going to have that image in their heads, and then they're going to, be up or have insomnia and anxiety and all the, worrying about it and everything. So I feel like we do kind of have a responsibility to each other, not to like lie and cover stuff up and pretend everything's all nicey, like 100% of the time. But in certain cases, there are. And the first novel that I ever published, I couldn't get it published at first because it was too long. but also it was, it had this very literary style to it, and a lot of poetic language and description in it, etc. But it had what I used to refer to as a Sunday night movie plot. And that's kind of an old-fashioned term, a Sunday night movie. But what I meant by that was a thriller, right?
Mhm.
It's one of those sort of cheap made for TV. Nowadays, they all seem to be like romances, but there's also a whole slew of, women being stalked, or, whatever. So anyway, I couldn't publish it back then. It was finally published in, I think, 1999. But I couldn't get it published back then because of this. Nowadays, I think I could, because the genres are not quite so strictly separated from each other. But the thing about that story is that, sure, it seems like a lot of cliches from thrillers. It's true, right? It's all based on the truth, and it's an amalgamation of two people in a way, right? Two families in a way that I made into one. But everything that happens in there actually happened. And I'm saying that now, like years and years later, like most of the people concerned in that whole issue have passed away. But back then I would never have said that, because I feel like I'm violating their privacy. And small town, it's a small city, I should say.
Yeah, Winnipeg is a very small city.
Else. So, yeah.
Well, I think it's interesting, and you raised a lot of really interesting points to consider. And I think there's some really good advice in there about how to actually approach doing this, and even just when to worry about it. Because I think often it never occurred to me, but I think it's a great point to point out that like so many people worry about this thing so soon, when there's no one holding your feet to the fire and saying you have to publish every word you write, and show it to somebody. There's no reason you can't be. So much of that pre-writing or drafting or testing, is there something here that is worth developing, or if that I even want to put public, is so separated from actually putting something public. And there's just so many things to consider in there. I remember doing a pass on a novel, or on the last book I put out. I went through and I just changed a couple names, even though there are stories in that book that are really clearly based on real events, and you use the people's real names. But then there's also like I remember like one there's like a name I changed just because I knew a person that had that name, and I didn't want them to think it was them, even though it had no connection to them. You know what I mean? Because there's also this weird problem of like, people always assume that writers are, I don't know if you find this, but I found that like, it doesn't matter how bizarre the thing I write is, they'll assume it's based on something or about them or whatever, right? If there's even like the slightest indication, it could be about a zombie, and people will be like, oh, that zombie was called Paul. Are you talking about Paul? Like,
I know that guy.
It's like, well, yeah, like it's just, I don't know. I wanted his little P name, and didn't occur to me. But like, there's also that assumption you sometimes will have to contend with, that people have, that the I is the speaker, the I is you, and if you're writing about something, it must be based on something else, and also I find that people have a real ownership about their experiences, even if their experiences aren't unique. Like if something happens to them, if somebody goes to and gets punched out, somebody gets into a fight outside the bar, and you write about how they get into a fight outside the bar, they'll act like they're the only person who's ever gotten into a fight outside the bar before, and it must be about them, or even it's somehow they own it. So without trying to convince people that they need to sweep everything under the rug, I think it is worth just kind of thinking at the later stage of the project, well, what really here has to be clearly like publicly known that it is true versus what might I want to disguise or code, or what is important to make really visible and plain, and so on and so forth. But as you say, it is kind of a thing that maybe people should worry about at a much later date than they do.
Yeah. I think a fight outside the bar is like a perfect example. We could probably come up with several other examples, but that let's stick with that one because I think it works really well. So there's some people who will say, oh, you wrote about, Dick and Jane and that fight outside the bar. And you're like, no, that wasn't them, right? And there's other people who will come along and say, that's not how fights outside bars go,
Yeah. Even
like,
if it happened and you're reporting verbatim, they'll say that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not how it happened. And one of the things I've learned about writing in general is that in a very peculiar way, I still think you should look everything up, and make sure that what you're saying is possible if you're writing realistic fiction, that is. And I do, but there's quite a few times when I've written a scene in a work of fiction, and I thought, yeah, it could happen that way, and then later I go and look it up, and like I don't think I can't remember a time when I was wrong.
Yeah.
Because things can happen in so many different ways. And so the wind can blow your hat right off your head, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't happen every time there's a wind, but things happen, right? And it's when you have too much coincidence in there, or it seems too far-fetched, but
or even just a late coincidence. If you have a coincidence on page 1, they'll give you that, right? Like, but
Yeah.
page 5, it's too late.
That's right.
There's all sorts of weird craft things, and as you say, like part of it is just figuring out. Honestly, like it sounds maybe like a cop out to say this, but I think part of this, like solving this problem in some ways, is a matter of figuring out as you do write more, what can you get away with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And what can you convince people to accept as the truth? Like what's the sort of tip-offs that you can give them and not give them? Like there's just so many ways to guide the reader that it's hard to that are subtle, and you can guide them towards thinking this really happened, or away from it thinking it really happened, right? Depending on what your interest is.
And sometimes it's like just all you have to do is think of that one sentence or even a little phrase to put in there, right? And I like what you said about, yes, a coincidence on the first page, absolutely, right? Because nobody's thinking yet, and nobody's going to say, wait, how come these two characters who are like both in the same story are in the same story?
Yeah.
Right. So.
But they'll give it to you. It's like if they're a vampire, they'll accept that. But then if the vampire runs into his aunt at a bar, well, that's too coincidental. Right? Like there's like this weird like calculus of what the reader will accept when,
Yes, yeah.
and how
you've built up the
they'll be like, well, vampires don't drink margaritas, but they'll accept that there's a vampire, right?
Didn't you know that? Yeah.
Yeah.
This set of things. So yeah, I've often been told that things that happen in my books were impossible, but the people have never been actually correct. So that, and then there's also, I've heard from writers, I can't think what writer said this now, but something I was reading when I was researching for the creative process class that I teach, and the writer was saying that, well, people will often think that you've based a character on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they never guess correctly, right? Because this one author was saying, well, that person actually was in the novel, but that was not, they chose them, they just didn't recognize themselves. So that's also funny, I think, that, and the more you write too, like the more actual stories you publish, for example, the less it's going to matter if somebody hits somebody over the head with an egg turner, and that really happened in real life, because you're going to have all this other stuff out there. as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and I'm glad you kind of were able to kind of bring it into teaching writing a little bit. I wonder, before we kind of end up, I was hoping you could talk just a little bit about that class you bring up, that creative process class, because I don't know of a class like that at many other universities, and I just find that a really interesting. I wish there was a class like that when I was going to school. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about just kind of what that class is and what kind of value you find it has to teach the creative process itself,
Yeah.
when you're teaching writing.
Yeah, I invented this course in about the year 2000 as a course. It was all things that I had been teaching, but put it together as a lecture course originally. So I had a number of reasons for wanting to teach it, and one of the main reasons was students' resistance to rewriting things. So I'd be teaching creative writing, and somebody would write a poem, and it's like, it's a first draft, right? Poem. So then I would try to encourage them to develop it further. And I don't really like to say to people, oh, you should put a seahorse, in line 3, or, this poem is sad, you should make it happier. So I don't really like to direct people, but I ask a lot of questions, right? And I might point out, the second stanza, I don't understand it at all. I don't get what you're trying to say there, so you need to make it more clear. These are the kind of things I usually do. And then I met this resistance in a lot of students. But then it's not real. Like, I wrote that out of my heart, my dog that I love, or, whatever the situation was, the bar fight that I was in. And I don't want to change it, right? So, because then it's not, real. And what you don't like my writing, or whatever, these kind of things. So I wanted to show them that, all of the famous writers also wrote and rewrote and revised and changed their minds and all of this. So one of the problems with this course is that really only the canonical writers that were kind of fetishized in the culture round about from 1940 to like 1980 or so, that those are the people who donated their papers to libraries, and so scholars have gone through and read their work. So it makes it for a very canonical course in a way. So I've got on there Sylvia Plath, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Hemingway, although I switch these writers around all the time. I haven't taught Hemingway for years now, but it is really interesting. So you can see the draft, some of the draft pages, and in the case of Fitzgerald, there's an entire complete first, or not a first draft, but a draft of The Great Gatsby, which they've actually published under the name Trimalchio, which had been a title that Fitzgerald had been considering. So you can look at, and so what I've done now, like this year, my students are going to be studying the hotel scene, which is very important in The Great Gatsby. It's like a crucial scene. And we've got a pencil draft of that, written in Fitzgerald's handwriting, plus the version from Trimalchio, which is probably like the second last drafts. It's very close to the publication of The Great Gatsby. So you have 3 versions of that hotel scene. We look at it and we say, what are the differences? What was the effect of the differences? Now, we can't know what Fitzgerald was thinking, so we can't say, why did he do that? Right? What was he trying to do? But we can see what direction it's moving in. And then we can look back and see, oh, he then went back and changed something else earlier. And that makes the hotel scene work even better, right? Or vice versa. And so it's really, if you're really interested in writing, it's a great course. Some people get in there and they realize, oh, they weren't quite that interested in writing because we're looking at the very small things. But
it's a fascinating idea for a course to me, and like just to kind of make that process more concrete and visible, I find is is hard. The way that I've done it in creative writing classes is I'll typically make them find a book they love and retype it. Almost all of them pick Harry Potter, and invariably by the time I make them retype like 5 or 10 pages. Although I recommend they do the whole book. Almost invariably, they pick a book like Harry Potter and they hate it by the time they get to page 3. It just destroys their interest in the book completely. But because they're looking really closely at like writing choices now for the first time, and so now they've their taste starts to enter into it in a different way. So I don't say this to knock on Harry Potter, but just to say like it tends to be it's a different way of looking at things in that granular level, and you start to kind of realize what choices are being made, and whether they're, maybe you don't know why, but you see what they are, and they'll start to notice like word repetitions and things like this, or whatever, and it becomes really they always report that like it's the exercise that taught them the most, but they hated the most as well.
That's very interesting, and you take, I think a book like Harry Potter is a kind of a fantasy book. I mean, both in sense of genre, but also in the sense that I think there's a dreamlike, I haven't actually read Harry Potter, but
Me neither.
I read books sort of similar when I was younger. And so you fall into a dream and you're picturing everything in your own mind, right? It's almost like has a movie type or dreamlike quality to it. So looking at the language, and I would guess that when you do look at the language of Harry Potter, it's not that interesting.
I don't know. I don't read those assignments. I just make them do it, and because it's just them retyping 5 pages of Harry Potter. But they report to me typically that, and then they also, what I think is the value of it, especially for prose. I think in poetry it's easier to see what the writer is doing, whereas in prose, so many of the techniques of fiction are to hide from you what the writer is doing. Right. And so when I make them redo it for fiction, because it starts to just make it a little more visible. And so often, just because you were so immersed in it, now I've broken the immersion by making you retype it, and it kind of becomes frustrating. But you can start to see it and look at it like a writer would look at it, and so I feel like that creative process class is almost like the extreme extension of that idea, just looking really closely at like what are the choices made, what are the differences, and most importantly, like you're saying, what's the effect of the differences? Because that process, writers don't like to talk about their process, or they talk about it in quasi-mystical ways or in a vague way that doesn't make sense, I think. And so I really like and appreciate when anything that can kind of get people closer to the process, and kind of looking at things not objectively maybe, but from that more like objective viewpoint. I'll even when I have people do editing, I'll teach them like if they write a story, say, I'll make them summarize the story on another piece of paper and then make their editing decisions looking at that piece of paper without looking at the story anymore. Because they need to separate the structure of the story out from the words they wrote before they start to attend to like the style, in my opinion. And it's hard to do, but like there's tricks to do it. One is just you put your thing away for 5 months and come back to it, but that's not practical in many cases. But like to me, like I feel like having a clearer handle on the creative process is so often, rather than the ideas you might have inherited about what the creative process is so much of the struggle for a beginning writer.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing about Fitzgerald, because
absolutely.
A really good example is that, and if people haven't read The Great Gatsby yet, well, too bad, spoiler alert. But anyway, he ends up dying in the swimming pool outside his mansion, right? And then after Fitzgerald has already written the whole draft complete with the death in the swimming pool, right, and everything, one of the changes he makes is he goes way back to, I think it is like chapter 3 or so. And he has Nick talking to Gatsby outside the pool. And in the draft, Gatsby was saying, let's go to Coney Island, let's go. Nick is saying, it's late, like it's like, go to bed, and Fitz comes along and he slips in this little bit where Gatsby says to him, well, let's take a swim in my pool. right? Do you know I've never once used that swimming pool?
Mm.
And wow, like later when you get to the death in the swimming pool, the irony just rings in your ears, because he had built that whole mansion and the swimming pool and everything on purpose to impress a certain person. And he's never actually enjoyed it. And then the one day that he goes in there, it's too late, right? Everything has already fallen
Yeah.
apart. And so little things like that I find very exciting. And it helps students of writing, if they're paying attention, and listening and doing their assignments, it does teach them that, when you're building something, you don't just start from the beginning and tell the story to the end and you're done, right? You're layering it, and it's more like building a house than it is something flat, right?
Oh, that's
So
wonderful. Yeah, I didn't know that, and that's a wonderful note. I think it really gets at that idea of that kind of nonlinear way the draft constructs itself, or the palette. You get this palimpsest of like writing over what you've written before, and it can apply also, I think, to this idea that you would write over top of life, or involving parts of it. Selecting what you're going to focus on, selecting what you're going to, say is true and hide is true, or just fabricate wholly. Well, thanks so much for talking to me, Catherine. It's been really a pleasure.
Thanks, Jonathan. It's been great to spend some time just talking about writing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again, and keep writing the wrong way.